Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're cutting deep into a really complex failure of strategy. We've got a stack of source material here that dissects a political and legal movement in Florida.
That's right. The effort to repeal a specific part of a statute, a limitation on damages in wrongful death cases involving medical negligence.
And let's be really clear up front. The goal of this movement, it was rooted in something deeply moral, right? It was about seeking justice, demanding accountability.
And preventing future tragedies. It was about standing up for surviving family members who had been through something awful.
Exactly. But our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the source material's really surprising argument, which is that the specific strategy they chose, focusing almost entirely on expanding civil jury trials and seeking these uncapped damages, was, well, fundamentally misaligned with those noble goals.
It's an incredibly tough critique. It really is. The sources laid out right from the start. They argue the repeal effort, as emotionally compelling as it was built on a flawed structural premise.
A flawed premise. How so?
Instead of designing a reliable system for accountability, the movement essentially traded what the sources call certainty for chance.
Certainty for chance.
Yeah. They argue that by focusing so heavily on civil litigation, they ended up substituting gambling for governance.
Yeah.
And for you, the listener, understanding why these cases operate more like a high-stakes lottery than a reliable path to justice. That's absolutely key to understanding why this movement failed.
Okay, let's unpack that immediately. Part one, let's talk about this idea of non-economic damages or pain and suffering. This is where the emotional side and the structural realities of the legal system really collide. So non-economic damages, that's the money meant to recognize the human loss, the profound grief. And the argument you always hear is that uncapping these awards is the only way to truly acknowledge the value of a life that's been lost.
And that is the compelling human argument. It absolutely is. But the sources challenge the functional reality of that money within the legal system.
What do you mean by functional reality?
They argue that these non-economic damages are not primarily a symbolic recognition of grief. Structurally, they've become something else. They are the funds necessary to finance access to court.
So they're the capital.
They are the capital. The money you need just to cover the astronomical litigation costs and, of course, the substantial lawyers' fees.
Wait, hold on. I want to challenge that because it sounds deeply cynical. Is the source material really suggesting that grieving families are structurally forced to turn their pain into an entry fee for the courtroom?
That's precisely the structural critique.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the overhead involved here. These lawsuits are just brutally complex.
Right.
First, you have contingency fees, where lawyers take a big percentage of any final award.
Right.
But then you have the expert witnesses. You need multiple highly specialized doctors, often from out of state, who are willing to testify against other physicians. That is not cheap.
I can't imagine.
And then you factor in discovery costs, years of depositions, travel, administrative fees.
Yeah.
You're easily into the hundreds of thousands of dollars before you ever get close to a verdict.
And that money has to come from somewhere.
It has to. And structurally, it comes from that potential non-economic damages pool, the pain and suffering money.
And meanwhile, you've got the economic damages, the lost wages, future earnings. That's the money that's actually designed to support the family now that, their loved one is gone. But that's almost never enough to finance this massive years-long lawsuit.
Correct. Economic damages are for survival. Non-economic damages have become the currency of litigation. It's this painful reality that families are structurally required to convert their loss, their emotional pain, into capital that gets divided up and spent just for the chance to be heard in court.
So the really shocking realization here then is that if this emotional pain is being transformed into dollars and it's being exchanged and spent to pursue justice, it functionally stops being a pure recognition of loss. It becomes what the source calls a means to an end.
It is the mechanism for paying the massive overhead of modern medical litigation. And it creates this immediate, almost impossible ethical paradox for the families. How much of my grief must I stake? And how much am I willing to risk losing just to afford the chance to ask for accountability?
And if that is the means to an end, then we have to look at how reliable that means actually is, which moves us perfectly into part two. Why the system they were fighting to expand operates with what our sources call lottery-like odds.
Right. It's a high-risk, incredibly resource-intensive gamble. The reality is that the vast majority of even strong medical malpractice cases get abandoned or dismissed early on.
Why is that?
because the complexity and the risk just make them non-viable for attorneys who are working on contingency. They can't afford to take that gamble.
So what are we talking about in terms of actual odds?
The data we looked at is pretty stark. The practical reality is that families face maybe a 5 to 10% chance of actually prevailing at trial.
5 to 10%.
5 to 10%.
Well,
Just
okay.
think about that. You are investing years of your life, your emotional capital, everything, on what is essentially a 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 20 shot.
That is just a brutally low probability. So let's break down the technical hurdles. Why are the odds so hostile? Because they must be designed this way for a reason.
They are. The system has a lot of gates. First, as we mentioned, you have that mandatory and very expensive expert testimony required just to file the case. An expert has to review thousands of pages of medical records and basically sign off, certifying that a valid case exists.
So that's the first gate. Many people don't even get past that.
Many don't. But then, once you're in court, you face two massive legal hurdles. The first is proving a breach of the standard of care, that the doctor made a mistake that other doctors would agree was substandard.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second?
The second is the one where so many cases just completely collapse. It's proving causation.
Why is proving causation so uniquely hard in a medical context?
Because you have to prove, more likely than not, that the alleged negligence, the mistake, is what caused the injury or death, and not the patient's underlying condition or the natural progression of their disease.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine a patient with stage 3 cancer. The surgery for that cancer has known serious risks. If that patient dies on the operating table, the defense will argue the cancer, or a known risk of that complex surgery, caused the death.
Right.
The plaintiff's side has to prove that it wasn't the cancer, but a specific traceable mistake. Let's say a misplaced surgical clip, or maybe a delayed diagnosis from months earlier, that crossed the threshold and became the direct cause of death.
That distinction sounds incredibly difficult to prove to a jury of non-doctors.
It is. It's incredibly difficult, especially in these complex cases with terminal illness or, a systems failure at a hospital. The defense just has to introduce reasonable doubt about which factor was the true cause.
And they almost always have the advantage there.
Overwhelmingly. And that advantage is reflected in the outcomes. Even when you have credible experts on both sides, the historical data shows juries favor physician defendants. Defense verdicts outnumber plaintiff verdicts by about 10 to 1.
10 to 1. It really isn't a fair fight. It's a lopsided wager.
It is.
So, if the system is designed to be low probability, high variance, that really throws a new light on some of the political language around this. The sources offer a fascinating interpretation of Governor DeSantis' phrase, Jackpot Justice.
Yes, they do. They argue it shouldn't just be understood as an insult to the families, though it's often, and understandably, taken that way.
So how do they see it?
The sources interpret it as a structural critique of the system itself, a warning about a system that offers hope through rare, random, chance-a-lottery win. And in doing so, it substitutes, that gambling for governance.
So it's describing a system where the vast majority of people get nothing.
Exactly. But the rare, massive payout distracts everyone from the need for a functional, systematic way to get accountability.
That's a powerful reframing. The governor's political phrase is actually being interpreted by our sources as an accurate description of the system's failure to deliver justice reliably.
Precisely. The system is designed not for widespread accountability, but for rare, dramatic financial recovery.
Well, if that's the case, let's move on to part 3, the hollow victory problem. Because even in those rare instances when a family does succeed, they get a win, or they settle, do they actually achieve their real goals? Accountability and prevention.
And too often, the answer is just a devastating no. The victory feels hollow. It feels empty, because the system is designed to deliver money, not answers or systemic change.
Okay, let's detail why.
First, those massive monetary awards. They're almost always paid by huge insurance carriers, not by the doctors or the hospitals directly from their own pockets.
Which means what, functionally?
It means the institution isn't required to explain what happened, or admit error, or fundamentally change how it operates. It's just a business transaction, not a reckoning.
And second, there's something the sources highlight as maybe the most tragic part of all of this. Confidential settlements.
Yes. If a family settles, those agreements bury facts and silence families forever. The very information that could lead to systemic change, the specific errors, the institutional shortcomings, it all gets legally sealed away, usually under a very strict non-disclosure agreement.
Just think about that loss. For so many of these families, the core motivation is making sure this never happens to anyone else.
Right. But the legal structure they fought so hard to enter often forces them to sign away the ability to share those facts in exchange for financial reliefs. It's a terrible trade-off.
And even if they do win a big verdict in court, it's not a permanent solution. That money, that finite resource that was supposed to recognize an infinite loss, it can be reduced on appeal and eventually it gets spent. And when the money is gone, what are you left with?
You're left with the same systemic lack of assurance that existed at the very start. The analysis is harsh, but it's clear. In these outcomes, nothing truly changes. No systemic failure is corrected, no standard of care is clarified, and no future patient is made any safer.
And that just leaves families without the closure they were really looking for.
Exactly.
Which sets up part 4, and this is what the sources call the most consequential failure: the missed opportunity for structural reform. It seems they chased the low-probability, high-drama win, and in doing so, they walked away from some very real fixes.
This is crucial. This is the heart of the strategic failure. The movement focused solely on expanding civil damages while ignoring the explicit and frankly more necessary path of structural administrative reform.
Okay, so where does that kind of accountability and prevention actually reside, if not in a jury box?
It resides in the state institutions that are actually empowered to enforce standards, to investigate patterns of negligence, to discipline doctors, and to force hospitals to correct systemic failures.
We're talking about government agencies.
We're talking about agencies like the Department of Health, the Board of Medicine, and the Agency for Healthcare Administration, AHCA. These are the system's watchdogs. They have the power to mandate change, to change policy, revoke licenses, require corrective action. These are structural remedies, not probabilistic ones.
And the sources detail a specific miscalculation here. The advocacy group put all of its political capital into this one very volatile demand for expanded civil damages.
And in doing so, they ignored a clear opening, signaled by the governor's office toward administrative and regulatory reform. It became an all-or-nothing fight over damages.
So what kind of tangible opportunities were squandered? What could have happened instead?
Well, because the repeal group, as the source says, dug in its heels for civil damages only, concrete reforms were just never pursued. Things like, for example, implementing a new state task force to study the problems with DOH and AHCA, or, introducing legislation to make sure that when citizens file complaints, they aren't just automatically dismissed by the regulatory process.
So they prioritized the spectacle of a courtroom battle over the slow, unglamorous grind of administrative work.
That's a good way to put it. They gave up high-probability, high-impact changes that would have reliably protected future patients, all in favor of an uncertain gamble for an uncapped financial payout.
You have to analyze the psychology of that choice. Why choose spectacle over structure?
Well, think about it. Litigation offers drama. It has clear heroes and villains. It offers the intense satisfaction, the, dopamine spikes of a dramatic win.
Right.
Systemic governance, on the other hand, is its meetings and hearings and regulations and slow, incremental progress. For someone gripped by grief and righteous anger, that slow grind can feel like surrender, even if it's infinitely more effective for long-term correction.
So if we connect this all back to the beginning, the central miscalculation was assuming that more access to civil court was automatically the same thing as more justice.
And it's just not. Civil litigation is, in the source's very harsh assessment, a blunt and inefficient and unreliable tool for uncovering system errors.
By focusing so heavily on the individual financial recovery, that lottery logic, the movement diverted critical attention and resources away from the structural reforms that could have helped far more families, far more reliably, and much, much sooner.
That's right. True justice in medical negligence has to start with truth, accountability, and prevention. And that is fundamentally achieved through governance, not just through financial transactions in a courtroom.
So we've looked at the cost of this system, the terrible probability of success, and the ultimate failure of the system to achieve its stated goals even when it works. The tragedy, according to our sources, isn't just that the repeal effort failed, but that the window for real, meaningful systemic change was squandered.
It was a massive missed opportunity.
So to leave you with a final provocative thought to consider, if our legal system forces grief to become a financial commodity just to buy access to the courthouse, are we ever truly serving accountability? Or is that intense focus on individual financial recovery inevitably a distraction from achieving the necessary structural change that protects all of us?
It really challenges us to look beyond the immediate emotional catharsis of a big courtroom win and to focus instead on the enduring power of the regulatory state to actually affect lasting change.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.